Hello everyone and welcome to this video by Intellipaat. I am sure you might be aware of what SQL is, but have you heard about PLSQL? Well, PLSQL is one of the Oracle's creations and that is what this video is about. Now before we jump into the video, please make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit that bell icon for more updates. Now let's take a look at the agenda. Firstly, we will see what is PLSQL. Then the difference between SQL and PLSQL, what companies currently use PLSQL, and lastly, some interview questions that will be divided into three sections, that is basic, intermediate, and advanced. Let's start with our first agenda, that is what is PLSQL. PLSQL is a blend of SQL and programming language procedural characteristics. It was created by Oracle Corporation in the early 1990s to improve SQL's functionalities. Along with Java and SQL itself, PLSQL is one of the three essential programming languages included in the Oracle database. Moving on to our next agenda, that is the difference between SQL and PLSQL. As PLSQL is just an upgraded version of SQL, that is, it is very similar to SQL but with more and better features. We will take some parameters into consideration. The first parameter is the definition itself. So SQL is structured query language for database, while PLSQL is a programming language for a database using SQL. Next parameter is variables. SQL has no variables and PLSQL has all variables, data types, etc. Now next parameter is control structures. SQL has no control structures like for loop, etc. and PLSQL has all kinds of control structures. Next parameter is operations. For SQL, it only executes one operation at a time, but for PLSQL, multiple operations at a time can be executed. Next parameter is language type. SQL is a declarative language, while PLSQL is a procedural language. Moving on to our next parameter, that is embedded. Now SQL can be embedded in a PLSQL block, and same goes for PLSQL. It also can be embedded in an SQL block. Next parameter is interaction. SQL interacts directly with the database server, and for PLSQL, no direct contact between PLSQL and the database server ever takes place. Now our next parameter is orientation. SQL is a data-oriented language while PLSQL is application-oriented. Our last parameter is objective. For SQL, DDL and DML statements as well as queries are written in SQL, while for PLSQL, program blocks, functions, procedures, triggers, and packages are written in PLSQL. Moving on to our next agenda, that is what companies use PLSQL. Firstly, we have the Bank of America that majors in banking. Then we have Humana that goes for general health insurance and services. Then we have UPS, freight and logistics services. Then we have Citi that also goes for banking. Then we have Citigroup that goes for general financial services and insights. And lastly, we have Amtrak that goes for rail, bus, commuter and taxi. Now we have come to our main topic, that is interview questions. We will start with some very basic interview questions, so let's get into it. Now let's start with a few basic questions. First question is, what are the features of PLSQL? By utilizing its procedural character, PLSQL offers the feature of decision making, looping and branching. PLSQL allows for the processing of several queries in a single block by utilizing a single command. As PLSQL pieces like functions, procedures, packages, triggers, and types may be bundled and saved in databases, applications can reuse the PLSQL code. By utilizing an exception handling block, PLSQL allows exception handling. PLSQL offers error checking and data validation before data processing, in addition to exception handling. When there is an Oracle engine, PLSQL applications can run on any computer platform or operating system. Next question is, what is meant by PLSQL table? Now, objects of the type table that are depicted as database tables are what PLSQL tables are. They are means to offer arrays that are merely temporary tables in memory for processing that is carried out more quickly. These tables are helpful for transporting large amounts of data, which streamlines the procedure. Now, next question is, what is the basic structure of PLSQL? Let's take a look. The block structure is followed by PLSQL's fundamental structure. Each block of PLSQL code is made up of a combination of SQL and PLSQL statements. Each PLSQL block is divided into three sections: the optional declaration section, the mandatory execution section, and lastly, the optional exception handling section. Now, next question is, explain PLSQL cursor. A PLSQL cursor is nothing more than a memory pointer to a location in which SQL statements and information about statement processing are stored. Context area describes this portion to memory. Now, to retrieve and analyze many rows, this particular section takes use of a unique feature called a cursor. Now, there are two categories of cursors. Firstly, we have indirect cursor. These cursors' execution cycles are managed internally by Oracle. Then we have the direct cursor. Oracle also assigns a cursor to the SQL statement and defines the execution cycle during SQL statement execution. Moving on to our next question, that is how to write comments in PLSQL. Comments are nothing else but sentences used to improve the readability of the code just because they have no bearing on functionality. Now, they come in two varieties, that is, firstly, we have single line remark and then we have multiple line comments. Single line comment is made by writing what we want to say in a comment next to the symbol hyphen. And multiple line comments, these comments have the following syntax and can be specified over multiple lines and goes as we use a backslash and star mark, we write a comment and same way it ends. Moving on to our next question, what exactly is a trigger and how can it be used? A database object known as a trigger is one that automatically runs when certain events occur on tables or views. Applying the integrity constraint to database objects is done using it. A database trigger is a piece of PLSQL code connected to a specific database table. Now it is employed or used for audit data modifications, log events transparently, enforce complex business rules, maintaining replica tables, deriving column values, and lastly, implementing complex security authorizations. Moving on to our next question, what data types are present in PLSQL? Now, in PLSQL, there are numerous sorts of data types. Firstly, we have scalar. Now, a scalar data type is an unstructured one-dimensional data type. Moving on, we have composite. The data type called composite is made up of many data types that are simple to update and have internal parts that may be used and changed collectively. Right. Next is reference. Pointers or values that relate to other programs or data components are stored in the reference data type. Lastly, we have large object. Locators for large items are stored outside of lines such as video clips, graphics, and other types of images are saved in the large object data type. Moving on to our next question, what constitutes a trigger's basic components? We have a triggering statement or event, then a restriction, and lastly, an action. Then comes our next question, what guidelines should be followed while performing comparisons on nulls? Now, null is never true or false. It cannot be greater than or less than other values. Now, aside from the concatenation operator, an expression evaluates to null if one of its value is null. Now, we have come to our last basic interview question. What is a PLSQL block? In PLSQL, statements are grouped into units called blocks. PLSQL blocks can include constants, variables, SQL statements, loops, conditional statements, exceptional handling, etc. Blocks can also build a procedure, a function, or a package. Now we move on to intermediate interview questions. The first question is, explain PLSQL execution architecture. Now, the Oracle server or any other application tool that supports Oracle, such as Oracle Forms, must have the PLSQL engine installed in order for it to compile and execute PLSQL blocks and programs. The majority of Oracle applications are created utilizing the client server architecture, and PLSQL is one of the components of the Oracle RDBMS. The client side consists of database requests, and the server side is made up of the Oracle database. We must understand that the PLSQL engine can exist in either the client environment or the server environment. In light of the aforementioned fact, as well as the fact that PLSQL is not a standalone programming language, the transfer of PLSQL modules and subprograms between server-side and client-side applications is made simple as a result. Based on the architecture depicted here, it is clear that the PLSQL engine is crucial to processing and executing PLSQL statements. When it comes to SQL statements, it sends them to the SQL statement processor. Now we move on to our next question, that is differentiate between implicit and explicit cursor. For implicit cursor, when a query yields a single row value, an implicit cursor is employed. For explicit cursor, an explicit cursor is utilized when a subquery returns several rows. The active set refers to these rows. All TLM actions like declare, open, fetch, and close require implicit cursor, while for explicit cursor, this is used to process multi-row select statements. Now for implicit cursor, no data found exception handling is done here, while for explicit cursor, this cannot handle the exception no data found. Moving on to our next question, that is what are the various functions available for manipulating the character data? Firstly, we have left. This function returns the specified number of characters from the left part of the string. Then we have right. This function returns the defined number of characters from the right part of a string. Then we have rtrim. This function would trim all the white spaces on the right part of the string. Then we have upper. This function is used for converting all the characters to the uppercase in a string. Lastly, we have lower. This function is used for converting all the characters of a string to lowercase. Now let's check out our next question, that is what virtual tables are accessible when the database trigger is running. The virtual tables that are accessible during the database trigger execution are then and now tables. Then.column and now.column are the names of the respective column tables. The only allowed column for insert related triggers is now.column. The delete related triggers can only use the then.column values. Update triggers are provided for both virtual table columns. Next question. What distinguishes rollback and rollback to state up to a save point? The transaction stays active even before the command is provided, since the transactions cannot be rolled back before the save point. Now moving on to our next question, that is what components make up a PLSQL package? It consists of the PLSQL package. It consists of a table and record type statements, functions and processes, constants and variables used in cursors, including tables, scalars, records, etc., names of exceptions and conventions for connecting an error number to an exception, and lastly, cursors. Moving on, next question is what are the benefits of PLSQL packages? Firstly, we have enforced information hiding. It gives the option to keep the data private or public. Next, we have top-down create. Prior to putting the modules into action, we can design the user interface for the code that is concealed within the package. Next, we have object persistence. For all PLSQL objects in the application, objects stated in a package specification behave like global data. The package can be changed in one module, and the modifications can later be referenced in another. Next, we have object-oriented design. The package allows programmers complete control over how to use the modules and data structures contained within it. Then comes transaction integrity guaranteed. It offers a certain degree of transaction integrity. Lastly, we have performance enhancement. All program objects stored in the database are constantly being checked for authenticity by the RDBMS. Moving on to our next question, that is, what is exceptional handling? Runtime errors are handled by a process called exceptional handling. It is modifiable in PLSQL. The exception block that PLSQL offers raises the exceptions, making it easier for the programmer to identify and fix the problem. The program's error handling code is included when an error happens. In PLSQL, two distinct exception types are defined. We have user-defined exception and system-defined exception. Next question is, what kinds of SQL statements are there? Let's take a look. Firstly, we have DDL. A database structure or schema can be created with the use of the data defining languages, that is DDL. Then we have DML. You can add, edit, and delete data from a database instance using the data manipulation language. DML is in charge of doing many types of modifications to database data. Then we have DCL, the commands of the data control language, that is DCL, that can be used to grant rights and permissions. Next we have TCL. Database transactions are handled via commands in the transaction control language. And lastly we have DQL. Data is retrieved from the database using the data query language, that is DQL. Now moving on to our last intermediate interview question. What kinds of parameters does PLSQL support? Now in PLSQL there are basically three different kinds of parameters. Firstly we have in. You can transmit values to the procedure that is being called using the in argument. You can use the default settings for the in parameter. It operates consistently and cannot be altered. Next we have out. The caller receives a value from the out argument. Since the out parameter is an uninitialized variable, expressions cannot use it. Lastly, we have inout. The inout parameter gives a method its initial values and then returns to the caller the changed values. Give a value to this parameter and treat it like an initialized variable. Moving on to advanced interview questions. Firstly, we have explain commit, rollback, and save point. So commit. Data is only modified in the database buffer, but not the real database when any DML operations are carried out. These DML transactions need to be committed in order to be stored in the database. For rollback, the changes made in the current transaction must be undone or removed in order to be rolled back. All modifications made since the last commit are undone by the rollback command. And lastly, the save point. This statement identifies and specifies a point in the ongoing transaction process at which any modifications made up to that point will be released, while any changes made after that point will be preserved. Then we have how can your PLSQL code be debugged? To debug the code, we can use DBMS output and DBMS debug statements. The output is printed to the default console using DBMS output, and the output is printed to the log file when we use DBMS debug. Moving on to our next question. What distinguishes mutating tables from constraining tables? Now imagine currently a table that is being changed through the use of the DML statement. It is referred to as mutating. It might also be a table with defined triggers on it. Now a constraining table is one that is read for the purpose of restricting referential integrity. Moving on to our next question. What distinguishes a stored procedure from a stored function in PLSQL? Now while returning the value in a saved function is necessary, doing so in a stored procedure is not. While a saved function can only contain either an input parameter or an output parameter, a stored procedure can have both input and output parameters. In contrast to stored functions, while a saved function can only contain either an input parameter or an output parameter, a stored procedure can have both input and output parameters. Also, in contrast to stored functions, where handling exceptions is not allowed, stored parameters can. Moving on to our next question. we have describe a subquery. What types does it have? Now, an internal query is known as subquery. The inner query is referred to as the subquery and the outer query is referred to as the main query. First, a subquery is conducted and its output is provided to the main query. We have two categories of subqueries. First is correlated and non-correlated. Moving on to our next question. What are the PLSQL skills for pragma exception init? An exception name and an oracle error number are linked together by the pragma exception init command in PLSQL. This makes it possible to define a unique handler for any internal exception and refer to it by name. And then we have our next question, that is, how do pseudo columns function and what are they? And when we talk about them, how do they fit into procedural statements? Although they aren't actual table columns, pseudo columns behave like them. In SQL queries, pseudo columns are utilized to retrieve certain data. Pseudo columns cannot be used directly in a procedural language, despite the fact that PLSQL understands them as a component of SQL statements. The following pseudo columns are employed. We have levels, we have cur value and next value, we have row ID. Moving on to our next question, we have what is a mutating table error? When a trigger tries to modify an active record, it encounters a mutating table error. Views or temporary tables can be used to solve it so that the database chooses one and updates the other. We have now come to our second last question. What are the differences between any and all operators? Now, all operators, what it is? Value is compared to every value returned by the subquery using the all operator. And what is an any operator? Using this operator, value is compared to each value returned by the subquery using the any operator. All operator denotes greater than the maximum. It also denotes less than the minimum. All is not the same as not in condition. Whereas any denotes something more than the bare minimum, also it denotes that a value lower than the maximum. Now we come to our last question, that is, what is a join? The term join is used to query data from many tables based on how their fields relate to one another. Now join heavily relies on keys. And that is the end of our video. Thank you so much.